All right, welcome back to the Think Good podcast. We are really excited for today's episode to talk about a TV show that has been blowing everybody's minds. Second season just wrapped a few days ago, and so we are recording this while our thoughts are fresh. Tell us about this show, Severance.
The Think Good Podcast, where therapists talk about TV shows, movies, books, and life.
Yes. So if you haven't checked it out already, please do. Apple TV. I mean, you got to know somebody who has an account, right?
Absolutely.
It is such a unique concept. A lot of big names. Dan Erickson, Ben Stiller created the show. Adam Scott stars in the show with a bunch of other incredible talents. And it really centers around Adam Scott's character, right? Mark Scout, and this idea of what happens if you undergo this procedure and your work self is completely separate from your personal self, right? And in this world, in Severance, this is a very highly controversial procedure.
Yeah, I remember the first episode even, they're like sitting around at dinner and Adam Scott's character is the one who has severed.
Yes.
And the rest of them are like asking these inquisitive questions.
Yes.
There's a little debate about it. And you can tell there's a lot of tension about this procedure and this kind of choice that he's made.
Yeah.
Because his wife has passed.
Yeah, so spoiler, I mean, that's like the first episode, but just spoiler alert, we're going to be kind of talking about different concepts of the show. So if you haven't checked it out, pause, go watch 2 seasons, and then come back. But yeah, I think really Adam Scott is going through this incredible loss. He's going through grief. He's lost his wife, Gemma, and he's having such a painful time coping. And so we kind of find out in this world that going through this procedure allows him to just separate from what happened to him personally and have this work life where he doesn't have to be faced with grief. He doesn't have to be the person who lost his wife. And so you get to know his innie, you get to know his outie, and then you get to know all the characters who similarly have undergone this procedure at Lumen.
And for some reason, if you haven't seen the show and you're not familiar with these terms, then please continue at your own risk, I guess.
Yeah.
But an innie is he goes in to the workplace.
Yes.
He goes through this like elevator
Yes.
system, and I think he even changes his clothes. So his outie is his kind of normal, regular self that lives his life, and then he goes through this transformation at the workplace and becomes his innie during his work hours, where he does not have any knowledge or memories of his outie's life.
Right.
And in this case, we're talking about somebody who has incurred a great loss or trauma of some sort, and maybe is choosing to live this lifestyle now because of that.
Yeah, and I think that there's so many like twists and turns in this world, and you're trying to kind of understand where they work. Lumen Industries, what is this place? What are they controlling? Who are they? What is the physical work that they're all doing? So there's a lot of like unanswered questions, but I think what's really incredible is you get to know each of the characters in Adam Scott's like team, I would say, right?
Yeah.
And so you get to know Helly, Dylan, Irving. Yeah. And those are kind of like the main 4, Milchek, who kind of like oversees them. And so you get these snippets of like their life, who they were before they were severed. And essentially like, what are they running away from? Why was this choice made? You're starting to kind of understand that and see that. And it kind of just poses the question of like, what do people think of this concept? Like, what if it was available to us in the real world? And so we thought this would be like a really cool episode to talk through.
Yeah, and I'm really excited to dive in because, there's so many themes here that we could probably spend an episode each talking about, the pros and cons. We're talking about the psychological concepts behind things like workplace environment, control, workplace relationships, that kind of thing. And then, work-life balance. And so we're going to try to get into some of these, but I could definitely see this as a return to topic.
Oh, absolutely.
For a future episode as well, because there's a lot to talk about here. I thought we could kick off today by reading some really great words and insight
Yeah.
from a friend of the pod. I always
Yes.
wanted to say that. A friend of ours, Arushi, who wrote a few words on Severance when season 1 was going on. So what she says is, separating work and home seems appealing at first, especially in traumatic and emotionally heavy fields such as medicine or first responder situations, where significant stress can often bleed into personal life, causing other problems such as mental health disorders, substance abuse, and strained relationships. Yet we see in the show that despite this complete identity separation, there are deeper rooted feelings that can exist and be experienced in both worlds. She says, Adam Scott brilliantly portrays, absolutely, how overwhelming grief, insecurities, and the sense that things aren't right in one identity can be inherently felt by the other and is carried into their respective world, whether they are completely consciously aware of it or not.
Wow. Incredibly
So,
written.
yeah, I think really good observation here of kind of the dilemmas that are at hand. So, I guess talk about, what really stuck out to you about this concept of
Yeah.
severance.
Yeah.
And, obviously we're putting a thing in our brain.
Yeah.
So
A
how can we
thing.
not talk about this?
It's actually so interesting because I think one of the first things I thought about when I saw this show was obviously the therapeutic implications of like, does your innie need a different therapist than your outie? Like, what's happening,
Oh,
right?
okay.
And so I started to kind of think about who we are and like right now in today's world in real life, not in Lumen. And just kind of like, we spend so much time at work. Like, what do we think of ourselves? What is our identity? What is kind of this transition that we do into the workplace? And oftentimes we have these really close coworkers, or you've heard of like the sayings of like a work wife and a work husband, and we get to kind of be a little bit of like different people at work sometimes. I mean, we're not always carrying our personal stress into the workplace. We have our own work stressors, and we're with people who understand us in a different way, right? Because everyone is seeing us through the lens of work. And so, this idea of being severed, it's like you just don't have to bring any of your personal identity to work. So when I think about Adam Scott's character, I think about this tragic loss of him losing his wife and the grief that he's enduring. Like, and so he has an opportunity to not walk into work and be the guy who has a dead wife. He doesn't have to be faced with maybe people feeling bad for him or not knowing what to say, or people kind of giving him a look or checking in. And if anyone's been through grief, there is this really challenging part in the beginning when you're sort of like reintegrating yourself back into the world, where people like check on you and maybe you don't want to talk about it, maybe you do sometimes. And so I was thinking a lot about it from a grief perspective, where you just actually get to forego that whole piece and just be someone else.
Yeah, and I think when I think about grief too, sometimes the hardest part of grief is realizing that the world doesn't stop, right? That
Absolutely.
your world maybe has stopped, but everybody around you carries on as kind of usual, right? And I think, to his character's credit, in terms of making that decision, it's like life has to go on, but it's really hard to do that, right?
Sure.
Not just for everybody else around him to find the right words, or how do how as a supervisor or a boss do manage somebody's performance, especially
Yes.
if it's a demanding job or one that requires timeliness or something, right? How do you manage somebody's reintegration back into the workplace, right? But for him, he's got to every day wake up and push himself forward and pack things away and compartmentalize in some ways. So you're almost doing that naturally. And doesn't just go for people who are going through something really difficult, but I think, like you said, right, we have this like work self.
Yeah.
And, where we kind of leave things at the door or at our car, and, where we try to find ways to, just focus on the work, right? And so
Absolutely, yeah.
sometimes it can be helpful to do that, right?
Oh,
To
yeah.
kind of leave things at home. I even talk about it with clients, like feel free to leave this in the therapy session. We'll
Yeah.
come back to it next week. Like get on with
Yes.
the rest of your life. So I definitely do see some appeal here to this concept.
Sure. I think the controversy here too is this idea of like, why would you undergo the procedure and like separate yourself in that way? Like, what are either this avoidance tactic or running from this, or kind of like, what is it doing for you, right? And it's a chip. It's essentially a chip in your brain, right? Is like how they kind of break it down in the show. And so, not something to be taken lightly. And I actually don't, this was something I was going to ask you, but we don't really find out if there's people who are severed. Do we talk about somebody who was severed and then they just don't want to be severed anymore? Like, do we know how easy that process is to like get out of it?
I think that's one of the mysteries of the show
Yeah.
is who do we trust?
Yes.
Right? Because I think the process, as I remember, is that you put in a request, and
Okay.
then if the innie
Yeah.
wants to leave the job, the innie puts in a request to the outie, I think in written form
That's
and or
what
video
it
form.
is.
And then the
Okay.
outie reviews it and then gives like a video response. But I think, and this is part of the mystery of like who's controlling things, who's pulling the strings, is like nobody ever gets their request approved.
So
to
that,
leave.
yeah, so that's actually why I brought that up too, right? Is because not only is it controversial, but essentially like kind of irreversible in that it's not within your control anymore, right? You're now sort of at the discretion of like Lumen, Innie, Audi, all these things. And so I don't think it's a decision that is taken lightly for any of these characters or any of these people in this world. And so it makes me think a lot about this idea of trying to face whatever you're going through, whatever transition is going on in your life, and this escape, right? This idea of like, can we escape our life? Because essentially when you get out of that elevator and you're outie now, you've now left your whole any world, your work world in there, and you're sort of back to like your default self. So it's just like this brilliant concept. I think we get to know each character a little bit over time. Season 2 is like heavier on the backstories. So you're starting to kind of learn who people are, maybe like why they made these choices and decisions. But a question I had for you too is, what do you think about, so not just the concept, but what were some of your initial thoughts around, like, how did you feel like the show introduced this concept, and like, was it an immediate buy-in for you, like when you were watching the show?
I have to admit that it was not an immediate buy-in for me. I think I don't remember what the other show was that I was watching on Apple. It might have been the end of Ted Lasso.
Okay.
And I think I had like they had just released the pilot of Severance, and a couple people had told me to watch it, and I watched it. It was like one of those for me where it was like too late at night to start a new
Sure.
show, and so I started getting tired. I was having a hard time kind of focusing on it and really like understanding what concept, because I was walking in blind. I had no idea what
Yeah.
the show was about. I just knew Adam Scott was in it. Love Adam Scott from Parks and Rec days, so I'm like, let me give it a shot. And then I kind of forgot about it, and then everybody, I think it's one of those two where I missed the boat for season 1. Everybody had already kind of talked about it.
That's right. You were a late, like
Yeah,
a late.
so I have watched all of the show, the last 2 seasons in the last month.
Oh, so it's like fresh
It's fresh.
for you. Okay.
It's fresh for
okay.
me because I started it because season 2 was going on. People were like,
Got it.
all right, you got to start now. And finally, I just decided to do it. And I watched season 1 in a matter of like 3-4 days.
Wow.
And season 2, I caught up pretty quickly. And then I would say like the last 4 episodes I've watched live every week. And so,
Yeah.
very fresh. And I'm especially after this finale, which was mind blowing, which maybe we won't give anything away about the finale or too much, but it really, dots are being connected for me as I'm reflecting on all of these episodes together.
Yeah, so for me, like I think because I watched it as it got released, I'm like a little foggy on season 1, but one thing I will say is the finale of season 1 might have been one of the greatest finales I've seen in a season 1 show. Like the way that it ended, I just like you got lucky because you just got to watch season 2 right after. We all waited like what, over a year. That it was incredible. So
What stuck out to you about that?
yeah, so just it's like this anticipation where you're just sort of waiting for Mark. He's starting to kind of figure out what's going on with Gemma, and like he's noticing pieces are not fitting, and he's trying to access. So his sister is like a big support for him in his outie world, right? And so just the ending I think was so brilliant because it ends with him just having a moment where his like innie and outie are like, he gets his innie accessed outside, and it was absolutely like incredible. So I think many things stuck out for me, but like you said, dots were being connected. They actually did a great job. Season 2 was a little bit slower in the beginning, but then dots started to get connected. So I think one of the things the show does is that it might be the long game, like be patient, but absolutely brilliant writing.
Yeah, and it really makes you debate internally the goods and the bads of each of these decisions and how the characters are kind of reacting to different moments. We really get a lot more backstory of the other characters in season 2 and start seeing their dilemmas between their innies and outies and those relationships, who they are outside of work and who they are at work, and even really seeing different possibilities for their identities.
Sure.
Thinking about like the level of confidence
Yes.
and how they're presenting in their relationships outside of work, and then how they present at work. And it really got me thinking about just how we mask, or how we kind of split our identities, how we compartmentalize things, and how closely our identity is tied to our work.
Oh, yeah. And I think just like from a cultural standpoint, coming from a South Asian background, just really being high achievers and kind of having that be this cultural component of like the expectation is our parents came to this country, we should be doing the most, right? Like whether that's from an educational standpoint, whether that's our careers. And so this idea of like work is so ingrained, like deeply ingrained in us, right? Our identity piece of like, who are we if we aren't working? And what does work mean about who we are? And so I think it makes me think of my dad coming here 40 some years ago, and just this idea that I heard a lot growing up, which is like we left our land, we left our people, we left the language we spoke, we left everything to kind of come here and give our families a new opportunity, a different opportunity, better education, like being in this place. And so I kind of thought about that a lot, which is we didn't necessarily talk about it, but it was demonstrated to us by like our parents working so hard. And so I think work for me has always been, a bit of a escape, but also just like deeply important to me, right? Because it's so much of who I am. And if I'm not working, we just had this conversation in our consultation meeting. Like it's a little uncomfortable for me to be off work. Like I'm sort of like I have a very hard time not checking emails, not checking in, not scheduling someone in. It's really a balance after I had kids where I had to sometimes be forced to not work. Like either I have a sick kiddo or I have an appointment or I have something that just doesn't allow me to access that work part of myself. And so I was thinking about it when I was watching Severance, which is like, what would it be like to go to the workplace and not carry all this responsibility in? Like, you've got kids, you've got a household, you've got parents, you've got all this stuff going on. And your work any just gets to experience like work, and that's it. So I thought that was just, it made me kind of think about how would that change your performance? How would that change your interpersonal relationships? We see in Severance, like love is experienced, right? Like in the workplace. And so what does it like afford you and what does it free you of?
Yeah, and work is survival, right? And when you're talking about our parents migrating across the country or across the world, and really the big thing is survive. How do I survive in a new country with a new language, with new people, with new kind of rules and cultural expectations, and this idea of kind of severing is was also something that like naturally had to occur, right? Whatever hardships that you might have been going on at home, you had to leave those aside so that you could function at work, right? Because there's also a lot of pressure as maybe somebody who perceives themselves as an outsider is an outsider to perform really well,
So you're
right?
saying our parents
Our
invented
parents.
Severance.
Yes, exactly.
They're the
Exactly.
OG Adam Scotts. Yeah.
I mean, try to ask your parents about their work life. They'll be like, "It's fine,
Yeah.
beta." And then,
That's the
right?
truth. Yeah.
So, I think that's what I think about too, but also because we're taught to then like take pride in our work
Oh,
ethic, right?
absolutely.
And so it's a priority. And so sometimes we over prioritize work, right? Like what you're talking about, this like feeling bad or feeling guilty for taking a few days off
Sure.
or disconnecting from work. I did that too, taking a longer trip recently. And yeah, it's a little uncomfortable. Like I should be checking emails right now, or I should be, shouldn't I be on the phone with somebody or something, right? And so it's very ingrained in us, this necessity to have work as, one of those top two or three pieces of our identity.
Oh, yeah. And I also think, like, who are we if we take breaks, we take vacations, we do self care? Again, not a concept that was like modeled to us by our parents, right? I mean, I remember my dad like traveling all over for work. And so oftentimes our vacations were like wherever he was already going or wherever he had a conference or wherever, like everything was still tied to work, right? Even like personal trips he took like were still somewhat under the umbrella of work. And so yeah, just I think our generation specifically growing up and saying, okay, well, do we have permission to just like step away from work, and like what does that mean if we prioritize ourselves?
And I think they even mirror this in the show where like if somebody misses a day, they're like, "What happened?
Yes,
Like are
yes,
are they okay?
yes,
Oh, it's been 2 days. Did their Audi die?" Like
yes,
right?
yeah.
There's this like over exaggeration
Oh
of like
yeah.
this person has missed work. And I think just as you're talking about that, I'm like making this connection that might be what they're getting at, that this
Oh,
like, oh my
completely.
god, you missed work, something serious must have had to happen,
Yeah.
right? And there's been a shift, right, in work culture around taking mental health days and not having to give reasons or having to feel guilt about taking time off work. And I think a lot of people really resonate with the tug of war of taking time off, which obviously can mean money, it have real benefits, but if you have paid time off or you have the ability to step back a little bit from work, there's still very much that pull to re-engage in work or to feel guilty about not being there. And I think they do a good job of kind of representing that.
Yeah. I had a thought too. I was thinking, what would it be like for you to be the therapist of one of the characters? Like maybe we use someone and kind of think about, because I was thinking of like Adam Scott immediately popped into my head and I'm like, man, where would I start?
I think the first word that comes to mind is avoidance, right? Like, why are we avoiding this? What is the, you know, I guess I would start with like understanding his decision. So like
Sure.
maybe a few weeks before this first episode or whenever, right when he's making that decision, I would be curious about that. Or if he's coming to me post making this decision, it's already happened, then understanding a little bit more about this is kind of a, a I'm thinking about like a coping
Yeah. Oh,
mechanism,
that
right?
was my
But
exact
a very
thought.
permanent
Yeah.
coping mechanism that he's making a decision to say, hey, I never want to mix these experiences.
Right. So like this impulsive coping almost.
Yeah. And I don't know, what if he has thought about it, right? He's an academic
Sure. They
in
do
his
show his
previous life
backstory.
before he
That's fair.
takes this job. He's an academic. His wife is an academic, and so I wonder if they've philosophically, existentially had conversations of the sort, maybe not exactly Severance, but, if that is, it kind of also gives me vibes of like, what's it called when the assisted suicide, right?
Oh,
And when people
yes.
decide to end their life,
Yeah.
right? And this idea of control.
Wow, that's a really interesting parallel. Yeah. I was thinking a lot from the therapeutic lens of just I guess I wasn't thinking about it of like when they made the decision, but also like who their support systems were. Like you get to know Adam Scott's sister, right? So what does it mean to her that she only gets to experience him like when he comes out, and that he has this whole other world and identity? Like she's also experiencing loss, right? Because she loses a part of her brother. She's lost her sister-in-law. And so I was thinking a lot about how it doesn't just affect the person who decides to get severed, but their family, their friends. I was thinking a lot about Dylan and this entire like in season 2 where you get to see his wife and his kids, and this really interesting complex layer of his wife, almost spoiler alert, but like having an affair with his outie, with his innie actually, instead of his outie. Yeah, and then like telling him about it. And so this like,
Yeah, there's definitely a dilemma here, right? Is it an affair?
well, it's like the same
It's,
person, but it's
you
not.
know, and I think that's the interesting piece of this is, you know, really how do we now define identity? If we're truly splitting somebody's identity, they're in the same physical body, but consciously they have no connection between the two, then haven't we created two sentient beings?
I mean, I think that's brilliantly done in the last episode of season 2 with Adam Scott, where you really get this sort of like micro look at like innie and outie. And without giving too much away there, we see it with Helly, we see it with Dylan. We genuinely start to understand, wait a second, these are two completely different people. Like just because they look the same and they're in the same body does not mean they're the same person. And so I think that really that starts to come to life like in season 2.
You know, as you're talking about this, you know, I'm thinking back to the first season where the versions of their work selves seem very superficial, very like unnecessarily like fake smiles and you know just what we imagine like our initial work selves to be,
Like small
right?
talk
It's very
and just
small
like
talky,
surface.
no depth to anything. You know, they're like excited about a cantaloupe party or something.
Man, it is so fresh for you. I don't
Right?
remember
and
these things.
and so you know there's little depth to their personality, and you know, I think my impression of that was, oh, this is not so bad of an idea, right? This guy is going through something really painful. We soon learn what the other characters, you know, why they have, and there's a couple characters I'm thinking about, you know, Christopher Walken's character in season 2 and his reasons around, you know, kind of wanting a fresh start. And
Absolutely, yeah.
you know, and so on the face of it, I can kind of see why you would want to make this decision. And it at first seems like no harm, no foul. These people are just there. They're happy to be at work. They're following the system of work. They're kind of doing their jobs without questioning what they're doing. It doesn't seem like there's a lot of depth, but that as we go and as we just go into season 1, we start to see that these innies are capable of depth. They are capable of a broader array of emotions than just kind of that muted version that they show at first. And I think then we start to realize the dilemmas and the ethics of splitting identities.
Oh, yeah. And I think like you experience the complex emotions of just humans and people. And I think you're absolutely right. Kind of like the brilliance of season 2 is that season 1 is just a setup. Like they're just these people who are just kind of floating through work. And then you really understand like the intricacies of like who they are in their work life. So I just, so many therapeutic themes came up in the show. Again, like you said, definitely going to be coming back to the show. Just really, really well done.
I'm wondering if we can start to wrap with kind of a thought experiment around like, would this work? What could we do to make this concept work in real life? What's applicable from what we've learned in this show?
It's so interesting, right? Because the first thing that I think about is that like, could we just create a little bit of access, like to have your innie have a little bit of access to your outie? Because I almost feel like that whole separation, like the dilemma is just they're such different people, and they're almost talking about this a lot in season 2, where like the outie is like devaluing the innie, and right, like this idea of like, well, you're just like my work persona, right? Adam Scott says that so brilliantly, like you've lived 20, his innie says you've lived 20 times more of a life than I have. And I just, that line really stuck with me because I was like, wow, like, yeah, like this innie is new. And so if we did this in real life, is there like a little bit of like access that they could have to each other? I'm changing the concept of severance, but I'm just thinking about that.
Well, that's the idea,
Yeah.
is what could we tweak to make this work? Because obviously there are aspects of this that can't work in terms of like the corporation itself and the mysterious nature of this work, and what are they actually
goats.
working on?
The
And the
goats.
goats and Brienne of Tarth. And so, there's so much more for us to talk
Yes,
about here,
yes.
which I honestly don't completely understand that
No,
part of things.
noted.
But, I think the idea already exists, right? And we already kind of do this, right? We compartmentalize, we put things in different buckets, kind of because we have to, right? And I'm thinking
Sure.
about trauma, I'm thinking about grief, where we have to, and in old ways, we suck it up, right? And we put it away. And I think in olden days, quote unquote, before people started to really focus more on their mental health, we used to just put it away and then never get it back out again, right? And we would just push things away. And I think people now are starting to try to find a little bit more flow, a little bit more balance between these work selves and the rest of ourself.
Oh, yeah.
But what would I do to make this work? I think maybe facilitating like periodic communication.
Right?
Like I think what we saw
Yes.
at the end of season 2,
Yes.
but in maybe a healthier manner.
Right. Like not like a
And
pleading, like, but like
yes,
really this openness, this
which
transparency.
I have to say, there were episodes in season 2 where I was a little lost and a little bit uninterested in a
The
couple of the
goats.
plot lines. But the way that they wrapped season 2 kind of tied a bunch of these
Absolutely.
different threads together, and I think that's just a brilliant piece of television and brilliant piece of acting by
I was
Adam
like,
Scott.
oh, I was like thinking about how he was playing like so seamlessly two different actors. Oh,
Yeah. And I think so that I think is where maybe there's some way to facilitate communication and understanding. I wonder, like, one of the things that the characters experience is like just a snippet of their Audi's life,
yeah.
and just knowing a little bit about what they're working for,
Oh, okay.
maybe adds a dimension to their work. But I think that's also where we start to go down this slippery slope of, how do you really keep those boundaries then? If the idea of Severance is to put a hard line kind of boundary and you give them a snippet of their personal life, then where do they stop wanting to know more?
Yeah, like you almost need to work in like a quarterly check-in or something, like something
Right.
that's like structured, that maybe leaves you wanting more, but you can't ask until the next quarter. Something sort of boundaried like that. Like that is kind of truly like a corporate world type of boundary.
Yeah. And so, I think it's really fascinating, and I'm really curious to see now where they go with this, because I think they've evolved the existential ethical dilemma here of work self versus Audi self. And I think too, what there's so many levels that they could go to here, but when we talk about work self versus outer self, or that Audi self itself has multiple kinds of masks or
Oh,
identities
yeah.
too. And so, it's almost like Inception in that way, where it's like,
Yeah.
how many more levels of consciousness can we tap into?
Yeah. I totally agree. I think like honestly, the show kind of brings you into a space where you're starting to think a lot about the depth of people, like us as humans, our personalities, who we are. It almost made me think about, how we always joke, like if somebody makes a joke and you you don't do your total laugh. You're just like, haha, that's your work laugh, right? Like you have these parts of yourself that are sort of like elevator small talk or your work laugh or your like we have kind of like created these personas of ourselves where we just kind of got to get through it. There's an expectation of how we socialize at work. And so it really made me think kind of outside of that box of like what happens if you're not really like putting on this persona, but that you're limited in just that.
Yeah. Very excited to see where the show goes.
Same.
Very
We only
excited
have
to
to wait a
talk
year.
more about it. And yeah, we have to wait a year.
Well, you do because like you binged everything, so you this is a big waiting
That'll be
period
tough.
for
It'll
you.
be tough.
Yeah.
I've got a couple other shows on the docket, a couple other shows that we will probably be talking about in
Yeah.
upcoming podcast episodes. So we're really excited. TV is amazing right now. There's a lot of important psychological themes being discussed, explored, pushed in our face, so that we have to address. And Severance is doing a brilliant job of that at a time where, I should add, where a lot of people have rethought what work-life balance looks like in the last 4 or 5 years. And
Definitely
so
post-COVID.
a very apt show for this time.
Absolutely. Again, if you haven't watched it, you got to.
Yeah, if you stuck with us through this episode and you haven't watched it, I know that we spoiled some stuff, but still worthy of a watch. Go back and get that Apple TV subscription. Let's work on getting paid by these guys.
Yeah, Apple. Seriously. Let's do it.
All right, until next time, this is the Think Good Podcast.
Bye.